to On the Middle East, Al Monitor's weekly podcast on the big stories unfolding in the region. My name is Amran Zaman, and today's guest is Hamidreza Azizi, a fellow at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs in Berlin and an expert on Iran's activities in the Levant. I will be talking to Hamidreza about Iran's role in Syria, where the United States and Israel have escalated attacks against Iran-backed militias, and where Turkey is threatening to mount yet another major incursion against the Syrian Kurds. Is Iran trying to establish a Shiite Crescent stretching across Iraq and Syria all the way to Lebanon? And how does this affect ongoing efforts to revive the Iran nuclear deal? Welcome to our program, Hamidreza. It's so wonderful to have you here today.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be on this podcast.
So we're going to be talking about Iran's role in Syria, and you're the big expert on this topic. Can you tell us exactly what Iran's role in Syria is? Can you explain the relationship between Iran and the government of Bashar al-Assad? And obviously the relationship predates that. You also had a close relationship between Bashar's father, Hafiz, and Iran. What underpins it? What are the dynamics that inform this relationship? Why is Syria important for Iran?
Yeah, of course. Looking at Iran-Syria relations and Syria's importance for Iran, basically so important that it prompted Iran's direct intervention in Syria, which is still ongoing after more than a decade. We basically need to look at two sets of factors: geopolitical and ideological factors, I think. So the first set of factors, geopolitical ones, is related to what you just mentioned in terms of, somehow the history of relations between Iran and Syria, which dates back to, at the current form in terms of a close partnership and then alliance, dates back to the early years after the Islamic Revolution in Iran. So basically, looking at the Middle East, Iran sees or has been seeing basically Syria as its main, or the only, better to say, Arab ally, while others have had basically different views, usually negative views when it comes to the Islamic Republic as the government, more specifically speaking. So in that sense, Syria has been important to Iran, and especially during the 8 years of war with Iraq in the 1980s, Syria was the only Arab state which took side with Iran and prevented the formation of a kind of unified Arab front against Iran. So that was kind of the foundation of Iran's basically alliance with Syria. And also, it is very important what we see today as Iran's network of non-state allies or partners or proxies, whatever we call them. I'm not going to go into the conceptual discussion of that, but again, the cornerstone of that network was kind of set in Syria or through Syria, which was Syria's role in the establishment of Hezbollah in Lebanon in the 1980s, and also the Islamic Jihad as the main two main elements of Iran's network. So in that sense, Syria has been very important to Iran. After 2003, the fall of Saddam, Syria became even more important in that sense, in the sense of Iran's access to its non-state allies in Lebanon, because Syria basically acted as a bridge connecting Iran through Iraq to Lebanon. So in that sense, when we look back to the events in 2011 and following the Arab Spring, when Assad's very survival was at stake, it was also a lot at stake for Iran in terms of the geopolitical advantages that it might lose, you know, in case it's yeah.
Yeah, can I just jump in there and ask
Sure.
you why did Syria support Iran? Why does it support Iran? What binds these two countries?
You know, in the beginning, of course, there was a kind of mutual interest in both cases that I mentioned, in the case of Iraq and also in the case of that non-state network. Because, you know, regarding Iraq, of course, you know, there was this competition or rivalry between the Ba'ath Party in Iraq and Syria, and between the person of Saddam and Hafez al-Assad. So Assad basically was never happy with Saddam trying to play the role as the main leader or the great leader of the Arab world. So that kind of intra-competition between Syria, intra-Arab competition between Syria and Iraq hugely contributed to the Syria's position in Iran-Iraq war. And then speaking of Hezbollah and Palestinian Jihad, you know, we need to take into account that before this crisis, before 2011, basically, Syria was also a very important actor in Lebanon's domestic scene, and as we saw in some cases, some very important cases like the assassination of Rafiq Hariri. So in that sense, it was a kind of mutual interest. I mean, supporting Iran's access to Hezbollah would also give Syria a kind of influence within that country, which it used to you know, benefit from for quite a long time.
Yeah, but there's also this perception that religion plays a part, and the fact that Iran is Shia and that the Assad family is Alawite also, you know, has a role to play. Do you agree with that? And can you explain the difference to us? I mean, we don't need to go into any great detail, but just so that our audience understands.
Yeah, sure. First of all, I don't really believe that religion plays kind of very significant or the main role here. It's more about geopolitics, and also maybe we can also mention down the road the role of ideology, which I make a distinction here between ideology and religion. But anyway, speaking of this so-called Shia connection or Shiite Crescent, whatever it is called, you know, it's not exactly the way that it's usually depicted, because you know, at the end of the day, the very notion that Alawites are or you know, were basically part of the Shia community since the beginning is very disputed. And it's a very known story that, you know, when Hafez al-Assad wanted to become, you know, the president in the country, because of the constitution that didn't allow non-Muslims to become presidents, and because the Alawites were not recognized, at least in Syria, as Muslims, he turned to Shias. And it was the kind of the Shia marjas or you know, high clerics that kind of helped him endorse basically Alawism as part of Shiism. So this connection actually between Shiism and Alawism is more political than religious to begin with. So yeah, that's one of the reasons I said religion doesn't play the main role here.
Well, that's such an important point, and thank you for reminding us of that factoid about how Assad helped, or rather was helped by Iran in getting the presidency. So today, does Iran actually have physical forces on the ground in Syria?
There's no exact reports on the number of troops, but that's for sure that Iran does have forces on the ground, mostly in the form of, you know, kind of high-ranking IRGC officers who work at the level of command in terms of coordinating and commanding Iran-backed proxies, both local proxies and those I would say, imported proxies, Afghan and Pakistani forces of the Fatimiyun and Zainabiyun forces. There was a time when Iran had a kind of more extensive presence on the ground in the early years after the outbreak of the war, but now it's, as I said, kind of reduced to command and control, basically.
Yet you just reminded us that religion does somehow have a role in all of this, because those Afghans and Pakistanis decided to defend the Assad regime because they somehow see it as protecting them, correct?
Yes, that's correct. The thing is that, this whole, those Afghan and Pakistani brigades, and also the Iranian, those volunteer forces who were organized and dispatched by IRGC, they are officially called in Iran as defenders of the shrines, which refers to the shrines of the Shia, figures. But the thing is that even in the case of the Afghans and Pakistanis, religion was not the only factor, because, I mean, of course, for many of them, especially those who were recruited in the early stages of the ISIS rule in Syria and Iraq, religion did play a role, but the more extensive mobilization that happened in Iran and by Iran was also motivated on the part of the Afghans, especially by financial incentives, because many of them were those who had lived in Iran since 1990s, since the first rule of Taliban in Afghanistan. They had fled to Iran, but they didn't enjoy suitable living conditions. So going there, getting some money, as was promised by the IRGC, that was one of the ways that they could also, make a change in their living. So again, we need to be careful in calling all of them as religiously oriented, basically, or motivated.
We hear that Iran is engaged in a very active campaign to convert Sunnis, especially in Deir ez-Zor, to Shia Islam. Is that true? Is that really happening, and why?
There is there's a lot of reports about that. So I think the actual trend is happening. There's no doubt about that. But again, with regard to the extent, there's no real certainty. But the thing is that, again, of course, I know I'm emphasizing maybe too much on the role of geopolitics, but that's the reality, for Iran, in Deir ez-Zor especially, that's good that you mentioned it. That's about the whole campaign with regard to Shiism, the whole establishment of armed armed depots, etc. All are related to Iran trying to establish a zone of influence for itself in Syria. It's more or less like what Turkey is doing in northern Syria, what Russia has been doing in terms of in the areas under its control, and also in big cities like Damascus, in terms of establishing Russian language schools. But Iran, of course, is doing it in its own way, more ideologically driven. But it's about, to my understanding, it's about building a loyal social base in a very important part of Syria geopolitically, which is Deir ez-Zor. So it's not a kind of messianic understanding of the necessity of spreading Shiism to other areas. It's about, as I said, creating a social base that could be relied on in the future if something goes to a kind of unfavorable direction for Iran in terms of, for example, the future of political process in Syria, the future of governance in general, in terms of potential federalism, whatever. In those cases, having a zone of influence is very important. And that's what Iran is doing in theirs.
Well, of course, a lot depends also on how things go in Iraq, because obviously that's the bridge. There's no physical border between Iran and Syria. You mentioned Russia and Turkey, the other two big actors in Syria. And along with Iran, they've sort of tried to compartmentalize their differences and advance their mutual interests in Syria under this thing called the Astana process. Where are we now with that? And do you think that the common interests continue to outweigh the differences? Or are we seeing a growing friction between these individual actors?
To me, the Astana process has lost its meaning and function for quite some time now, because it was basically established as a mechanism to de-escalate tensions between the three actors, and of course between the sides that each of those three actors were supporting. But and at some point it was kind of successful in reducing tensions in the specific parts of the country. But then, as it was more or less also clear since the beginning, Russia, Iran, and of course the Syrian government used it as a pretext to go step by step towards kind of establishing their control all around the country. So in that sense, Astana has lost its meaning. But as I can see now, the three countries, especially Iran and Russia, are trying to give it new meaning because what we saw in the latest Tehran summits of Erdogan, Putin, and Raisi, and also what was mentioned by the Iranian Supreme Leader Khamenei, it's like they want depicted again, especially Iran and Russia. For Turkey is more like a matter of maneuvering, I think. But these two countries want to show it as a kind of non-Western or even anti-Western grouping. But this wider geopolitical context aside, in Syria itself, things are much more complicated, especially between Iran and Turkey. For Iran and Russia, of course, there was a time when competition started to rise because the main common goal, which was to establish Assad's rule and kind of to defeat the ISIS, etc., those things that would bind Russia and Iran together, they went away, and Russia and Iran started to compete. But then, since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we can see somehow a new era of coordination and cooperation, I think, between Russia and Iran, because of course Russia doesn't have the capacity to be actively engaged in both fronts. This doesn't mean that Iran is going to take Russia's place, but that means, as I said, a kind of more active role by Iran. And briefly about Turkey, I think, Iran and Turkey used to compartmentalize, of course, their differences in Syria, despite taking different sides. But that was the case until 2020, when the Iran-backed forces for the first time went into a kind of direct clash with Turkey. And, before that, the two sides basically kind of recognized their zones of influence. Then the presence of Iran-backed forces and the clashes that erupted somehow changed the calculations of the both sides. On the one hand, Turkey is concerned that Iran is going to kind of spread its proxy groups toward the Turkish borders, and also it's also concerned about Iran's ties with the Kurdish or some elements of the Kurdish militias in Syria.
Particularly around Afrin, right? There's
exactly.
a lot of talk about cooperation between the Iran-backed militias and the PKK offshoot, the Afrin Liberation Front, I believe it's called, that's fighting Turkey and its proxies.
Yeah, that's right. And then on the other side, Iran is worried that Turkey is going to kind of is looking for an opportunity actually to get more, and it's not going to leave the areas which has been taken under its control over the past few years. And this doesn't mean that Assad's rule is not going to be as complete as at least expected by Iran. So these are the
Okay,
main
so
points of contentions.
let me then jump in with another question. Now, we know that Turkey is kind of exploring the possibility of some kind of normalization, for the lack of a better term, with the Assad regime. And this is definitely something that the Kremlin is encouraging. How does Iran feel about this? Because you say that Iran, views Syria as its own zone of influence, and obviously would not want Turkey, therefore, to expand its influence any further through making up with Assad. Is that correct? Or does it sort of think, well, that's not such a terrible thing after all, because if this does happen, then that just makes Assad's position that more secure?
It's both to some extent, and that was the case also about the Arab normalization or GCC normalization with Assad. Of course, it's been limited to UAE so far, but these kinds of normalizations, if we may say, faces Iran with a dilemma. On the one side, as you mentioned, it's good because it would bring Assad more international acceptance and legitimacy. But on the other hand, it means, in the case of GCC, of course, more rivals, especially in the economic field. In the case of Turkey, kind of a complicated situation because on the one hand Turkey is there, on the other hand Russia is pushing the two sides toward the kind of accepting the status quo, as it seems. So Iran is taking, basically, when it comes to Turkey, Iran supports Assad's position that any kind of meaningful normalization could happen only if Turkey leaves Syria and cede the control of those areas back to the Assad regime. And that was the reason, I think, why Erdogan just a couple of weeks ago praised Russia's position, but then said something like, we couldn't reach an understanding on the matter with Iran, if I remember correctly. So that's how I see Iran's position with regard to that. Not objecting, but at the same time, calculating the risks and challenges.
So as you say, it's terribly complex because, on the one hand, Iran sees it in its interest to support the Kurds against Turkey in certain circumstances. We see this playing out in Sinjar and Shengal in Iraq, and to some extent, as we mentioned before, in Afrin. Yet, at the end of the day, these two countries share a common fear of the Kurds, Kurdish irredentism, and have been known to cooperate against them. Isn't that right?
Yes, that's right. And, when it comes to Syria and the Syrian Kurds, Iran's support for the Syrian Kurds is more related to the US, not to Turkey. So that's very important to consider because, for Iran, basically opposing Turkish operations and also cooperating with the Kurds has more to do with an attempt to distance the Kurds from the United States and kind of undermine the US position there. In that sense, I would say Iran's relationship with the Syrian Kurds is more tactical than strategic and more opportunistic than, kind of long term. Otherwise, of course, as you said, there's a lot of cooperation, and it was just recently that one of these Kurdish militia commanders was killed by Turkey in Syria.
Yes, somebody I actually interviewed him in Kandil on the Iranian border some years ago in 2015. Yeah.
Yeah, I see. So then, of course, that's one of the examples of this cooperation. So I think, at the end of the day, Iran and Turkey understand each other's geopolitical concerns very well, but they cannot help but to continue this competition as well, because both are, regional powers with, I would say, extra-regional ambitions. And for that reason, this competition over zones of influence in Iraq, in Syria, in other places continue, while at the same time they try not to open the door, close the door for cooperation when it comes to the issues related to their survival and national security.
So on the one hand, you say that Iran, much like Russia, is very keen to see the United States get out of Syria, and you have these periodic attacks on US installations inside Syria, not very successful ones, but still it's a form of harassment. And then, of course, the US retaliates. How does that chime with the effort to revive the nuclear deal?
I think that's also one of the very interesting areas that, there's an agreement on the Iranian side and the US side to compartmentalize the issues, because that was very interesting to me, hearing the US officials saying just a few days ago, when this new wave of escalation happened between Iran-backed groups and the US in Syria, that, this has nothing to do with the JCPOA. And for Iran, although not declaring that, but then that's quite the same, because the very idea behind the current administration and the Iranian government in general, involvement in talks with the United States, is to find a solution for the JCPOA, and they have been quite for the nuclear issue. And they have been quite clear on that. That's not going to affect any other element of Iran's regional policy. And to some extent, it seems that the United States has also come to accept the fact that there is little way to actually address these issues together in one single format. So the United States also tries to stand firm, or show firmness at least, against Iran-backed groups, as it did in responding to the Iran-backed groups' provocations, but at the same time, both are talking with each other. So I really don't see any, serious kind of negative implication for the nuclear issue, if it's going to reach a successful conclusion at all, which I'm not very optimistic about.
You're not optimistic. Well, Israel would be pleased if your pessimism proved to be well placed. And Israel is also, of course, constantly attacking Iranian assets inside Syria. Do you detect any change, though, in Russia's sort of tolerance of those attacks because of Israel's position on the Ukraine conflict?
What I can see is Russia kind of sitting aside, just doing nothing, looking what's happening between Iran and Israel. Because before that, Russia used to play a kind of play the role as of a de-escalator, I would say, by initiatives like reaching an agreement with Jordan and Israel to limit the scope of Iran and Iran-backed groups' activities in Syria and things like that. But now that the Ukraine crisis, as I said, has reduced the capacity of Russia's involvement in Syria, and on the other hand, there have been frictions between Russia and Israel. So what Russia is doing is to just, not do anything. Russia is not, doesn't seem at least determined yet to take action against Israel because of its own calculations and the very fact that it doesn't want Israel's involvement in supporting Ukraine to go beyond a certain extent, of course. But then this is very dangerous, I think, Russia sitting aside, because, we've seen a kind of actually increase, not decrease, in the level of Israeli attacks and the scope of them in the past few months since the start of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And on the other side, I think the Iranian side is getting more determined, based on the narrative that I can follow on the Iranian side, that there's a need to show a firm response at some point, especially if the JCPOA talks fail. I think Iran will do Iran is expected at least to do some bold move, against Israel in Syria in response to those attacks.
And so would that play out in Lebanon, you think?
It would involve many parts of the region. I think any kind of Iran-Israeli escalation would involve other countries, even GCC countries like the UAE, who has been trying to mend fences with Iran. If that escalation happens, and if it goes beyond a certain extent, I think that won't be limited to Syria, and other countries would be somehow involved. And that's the reason why, although I'm not optimistic, I still hope that some good outcome would come out of the negotiations.
Well, let's hope. Yes, let's hope that something good comes of it all. Thank you so very much for being with us today. That was a fascinating conversation, and we look forward to reading more of your exceptional work, Hamidreza. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was very nice talking to you and being on the show.
I'm Elizabeth Hagedorn, and I'm the State Department correspondent at Al-Monitor.
And I'm Joe Snell. I'm Al-Monitor's video editor. Let's admit it, this past year has been difficult to stay on top of the news and sift through what's accurate and what's misleading. Let Al-Monitor help you.
If you care about the Middle East and North Africa, you should consider listening to Al-Monitor's audio series On the Middle East with Andrew Parasiliti and Amber Zaman, and On Israel with Ben Caspi. You can now watch our newest video podcast, Reading the Middle East with Gilles Capel. You can subscribe to these series on your favorite podcast platforms.
And through a host of free daily and weekly newsletters, we offer a range of perspectives with the highest journalistic standards. You can subscribe to these newsletters at almonitor.com.
As an award-winning media service headquartered in Washington, D.C., Al-Monitor has a network of over 160 contributors around the world.
So if you haven't done so already, be sure to visit almonitor.com, where you can find all of these newsletters and podcasts along with first-class reporting and analysis.
And this brings us to the end of this week's On the Middle East. Thank you for tuning in. Goodbye.